So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the last set of lectures of this course. I hope you enjoyed. It was like fantastic to see you all there. So what we're going to cover this last day is more specific about flexibility from distributed energy resources and different types of resources, including related to sector coupling, integration of different energy systems, so-called multi-energy systems, how we can extract the flexibility from sector coupling different energy vectors. Then we will see specific applications, including smart districts, smart buildings, community energy systems. And then we will also look into some techno-economic aspects of distributed resources and the idea of deploying flexibility from DR also for commercial purposes, and attached to that, of course, the idea of having more and more virtual power plants and distributed energy markets. It is, as you can see, the whole lecture is divided into 4 blocks. There'll be a set of slides you should have in Canvas, block by block. You should have all the slides, so you should be able to follow very smoothly what I present you also with your slides. We want to take notes and all that. And then addition to that, at the end of each block, there will be a live demo that will be performed, or will show you in through the use of Jupyter Notebook again, different aspects of what I'm going to tell you about the different blocks. The Jupyter Notebooks are not yet in Canvas, but will be there at the end of the lecture. Yeah, I would just start. Feel free to ask questions as always. You know, if you write in the Q&A, try to have a look every now and again, or during the break. As always, it would be about 5 minutes break at the end of each block, and then about 20-30 minutes after the second block, so we can breathe a little bit. So yeah, I mean that's it. So let me now go with the first presentation, and let me just stop sharing this, and let me show you. Then yeah, you should be able to see my slides now. So as I said, the first block is about understanding better the flexibility from distributed resources, particularly look at the aggregation of distributed energy resources. So what I will cover is really general aspects of flexibility, just that everyone is on the same page, and how we would characterize DR flexibility, particularly through metrics and maps that explain what flexibility from DR is. And then a couple of methodologies, in particular OPF approaches to build these flexibility maps. And then there will be some illustrative case studies, will be examples I will give you, but and also some demo with the Jupyter Notebook, as I mentioned earlier. There will be the references in each slide. You will see some references, and then I will also put some of these references as like primary papers in Canvas, so that for your convenience should be easy to see where the work I'm presenting is coming from. Now, just to create a little bit of context, it's this work, everything I'm presented, should really be seen in the context not only of technical modeling, but really techno-economic modeling. Because as I'm showing here, I'm sure you would recognize the Large Hadron Collider here at CERN. This is like one of the largest machines actually built by engineers and physicists. So if you think that engineers can build this kind of machines, of course, if we talk about low carbon energy system, that's relatively easy for engineers to really do it. There are different ways of achieving it, and even 100% renewable system possibly. The problem is the cost of this, because again, if you have infinite money, you can send them to the moon like NASA did a few decades back already. The problem is that we live in a world of scarcity of resources, including like economic resources, and that's it is in this context that we need to deal with all the challenges of a low carbon system. So what we're going to show you indeed links somehow to both technical and economic aspects. And sometimes, this is not even just economics. It may be more policy and regulation. Towards in the fourth block, actually, we'll see a few more details in this direction. Now straight to the topic. What is power system flexibility? Well, system flexibility in general is the ability to cope with events that may cause imbalances. This is pretty much for any system. If we look at power system flexibility, there are several definitions we can take. I'll put here a couple, and if you take, for example, the one by Ulbig here, let me take the last point. If you take the one by Ulbig, effectively, it's the technical ability to regulate the power exchange with the grid. So this is really like a technical view of flexibility. You can also add some economic view of flexibility, and this is I just said, and I will show you probably our view, like Techno-Economic flexibility and how you see this from different perspectives. What are the essential features of flexibility? Well, if you look at the work of Makarov, he introduced the so-called flexibility triad. It really associates for power system flexibility to the idea of having sufficient ramp rates, sufficient power capacity, and sufficient energy, especially for energy limited resources such as storage, to, of course, respond to imbalances. So the definitions above somehow are general, like what is flexibility. In Makarov, you really see somehow already how you measure flexibility in terms of rates of change, the capacity that you need, so how much actually you can change overall if you were not constrained by ramp rates. And of course, if you need energy to move from one operational point to another, do you have sufficient energy, especially if you have some kind of storage resource? Everyone will be very familiar, I hope, with the challenges that are brought by integration renewables in terms of flexibility. Put here some example. You see classical system dispatch with no wind in this case. It could be like a typical European system. This was somehow designed for the UK system some time ago, with a baseline of nuclear and then coal, gas, some peaking plants, typically hydro. The moment that you start introducing wind, you see that there's lots of variability in the net load, so load minus renewables, and including issues such as minimum load in the system that would somehow start impacting the minimum stable operating constraints of nuclear power plants, for example. And then you would be very familiar with the DAC curve that some time ago the California ISO introduced to discuss the challenges brought by solar energy, particularly in central hours of the day, where solar energy would again decrease significantly the net load seen by the system. However, then the system would need to go through a very steep ramp during the evening up to cover the, in order to cover the evening peak, especially if it's like a spring day in California, where the air conditioners are not on yet, so the peak is still in the evening, but at the same time there is lots of sun during the day, so you see this typical shape. And this issue of the very steep ramps that can be actually up but also down, as you can also see here when you deal with wind, is becoming really significant in all the countries where renewable penetration is quite substantial, and including Australia, actually, that there are quite some issues with ramping, and there are several discussions about introducing new markets actually to deal with this ramping, as is being done in California and in other places. Now, when we look at flexibility today, where is it coming from? This is just a sketch. It's not perfect, just to try to capture a little bit in a schematic way who the flexibility providers are and so on. And then if you imagine that there is a consumption that can be relatively flexible, Then there may be generators that are relatively, again, inflexible, like nuclear and coal. Then there are generators that got a much higher degree of flexibility, gas generators, hydro, of course, could be combined heat and power. So plants that produce both electricity and heat, either got some heat storage. We'll see a lot more of this. And then, of course, if you are an interconnected system, like most of the system, you can also borrow and case lend flexibility. So there is, through transferring energy, actually, you also transfer somehow flexibility and reserves, all that. Now, what's happening is that historically, as you can see, all the flexibility has come in one direction. So the flexibility providers, basically, when we studied fundamentals of control power systems, that's really all about the synchronous generators pretty much. And you do frequency control, voltage control, and it's all about synchronous machines or other controls they are related to modulate the active reactive power flows in the transmission network. Very, very little actually happens to the distribution in the distribution system, or used to happen in the distribution system, and the demand would effectively be basically flexible, and you will not have many controllable resources in general in the distribution system. So flexibility is really moving from a system that is providing flexibility transmission system to a relatively inflexible distribution system. And then when we talk about predict and provide, like the classical rationale for sort of classical power system, there is demand, whatever it is, you try to predict it, and then you through scheduling and dispatch and other controls that you have in the transmission system, you try to make sure that the power flows are right and all the system is within constraints. What you would do in the distribution system is basically so-called passive management, since you would not do anything at all. You would resolve the control problem at the planning stage, meaning that basically you would build the network so big to deal with the worst case scenarios, including some security constraint like N-1 and -2, in some cases also in distribution networks, so that you basically would not need to do anything in real time. There's no active system. Then again, the idea of having a flexible system in distribution network. Things are obviously changing a lot, because now with more and more distributed energy resources, but also large scale renewable energy sources coming into the system. So I'm sure here somehow connected to the sorry, I said distribution and transmission system, the wind and solar farms. The system is changing significantly, and in fact, because of this, and we've seen this in Australia, with more and more such resources, a very low marginal cost, possibly with market incentives and all that, many of the traditional flexibility providers are actually disappearing from the system. So what's happening is that there are fewer and fewer coal and gas generators because of technical reasons. Maybe they are reaching the end of their life, but also because of commercial reasons being pushed out of the market by renewables. Again, just normally, or because through incentives of governments. So when there are more and more these renewables, are these renewables able to provide the same flexibility services? And when I say I don't mean just technically again. I also mean, do we have the right commercial and sort of regulatory, including standards, set up to deal with this? Well, the answer at the moment is effectively no, and that's why we somehow this kind of research work and including this course to describe really the challenges and the next steps. Because obviously, if the traditional providers of flexibility are no longer there because they've been pushed out of the market, and renewables and other resources are not set up, and again, not only technically, also commercially, to provide flexibility services, that's what you get, right? And obviously, you can get a lot worse than this. This is not science fiction, by the way. This is it's already happened. It's not a far future at all. It's actually a very close past, and we're seeing this more and more. And just to give you an example, this is just a picture of the separation event and then the blackout that happened in South Australia in September 2016, where affected South Australia collapsed after it got disconnected from the system. There were different issues that I guess many of you would know about, including extreme weather, issues with protection systems and wind farms, issues with flows and interconnectors. So there was a lot happening. Definitely, and we're seeing more and more. This was 2016. There have been many such events happening throughout the world. Couple in Australia, a couple more in Australia. There was an event in the UK. It was like 2018 or 2019. So these issues are material. It's really not the future I'm talking about. It's already the present. So obviously, we need to find a way to solve the problem, or at least try to understand the problem first, actually, and then try to solve the problem. And of course, when there is a problem, engineers find a solution. And you may remember that after blackout, first thing that happened was Elon Musk by tweeting basically with South Australia Premier and say, I can build the largest battery in the world, and this will fix the problem. But it did build it, and partially helped a lot actually with some issues away in South Australia, although probably even if the battery being there for the blackout, nothing would have changed. But yeah, I mean, this is just can't really say much. You can just look at some desktop exercise to see what the battery would have done. However, certainly this pushed a lot the development of new technologies, and in fact now batteries are really widespread. Not only large-scale batteries, for which Australia is really leading the world, but also distributed batteries. And I think we have like extremely high penetration of batteries in Australia, and also in terms of sales worldwide. I think like very large percentage. So certainly in terms of like pushing for new technology, that event and then all this interaction actually helped a lot. So this to say that if actually when we look at the future, there would be new technologies that will provide new flexibility service, and some of them are already there. Now, how do I look this in the context of distributed resources? Is it all to be done by large-scale batteries, or there would be other issues there? Well, obviously storage it can help a lot, particularly batteries. But then when you look at the real future and a system level analysis and whole system analysis, then you realize that the more and more you have renewables coming to the system, the more diverse storage somehow you would need. So for example, when you look at this, it's coming from like paper of some time ago, where what we did was we studied for different countries, and particularly Europe, US, and Germany, and different studies that were carried out in different countries for different penetration levels of renewables in different countries. What this kind of studies, including some sort of real system of that, would envisage that systems would need in terms of power capacity of storage and energy capacity of storage. Now, apart from the absolute capacities that you would need, that also depend on the size of the country. Obviously, Germany is only a part of Europe, and the US is roughly a similar size as Europe. So apart from the absolute size, it's clear that there is some kind of linear trend. So with different penetration levels of renewables, there is some form of linear trend of the capacity of storage that you would need. And then also depending on what kind of portfolio of resources you have. For example, is it portfolio dominated by solar PV or by wind, or maybe a balanced portfolio? Then also the kind of storage characteristics will change a little bit. However, when you look at the energy capacity that you need, so this is the power capacity, gigawatts. If we look at the energy capacity we need in gigawatt hour, you would see that the trend is no longer linear. Somehow it saturates. However, the catch here is that the scale that I'm plotting here is actually a logarithmic scale. So this is like a linear scale, this is a logarithmic scale. So effectively it means that when I look at the first parts, so it grows linearly and then it saturates, yes, but it's still on a logarithmic scale. So this is to say that the more renewables we have in the system, effectively, the more and more energy we will need, not capacity. So the traditional batteries that we see at the moment that might have like 1 or 2 hours storage compared to the in terms of energy compared to the power capacity may certainly not be suitable, and we need to be looking into different types of batteries in case, for example, flow batteries instead of what we have today, and many longer term, of course, different types of storage and many discussions for a seasonal storage, for example, hydrogen and those kind of things are actually coming from these considerations. Because of all this, then they say, okay, but then maybe it's not just batteries, there is something else. Yes, there is. And in fact, when you look at this and you start looking into also aspects such as electrification sector coupling that we'll see better in second block, you realize that effectively storage as energy storage in an electrified system, in a system that is now coupling electricity to the whole sectors to decarbonize the whole energy system. Again, we'll see later more. So this storage can actually come from different sources, and many of them, most of them are actually distributed. So it's not just batteries, a large scale, or in case at the level of buildings or communities, as again we'll see, but could be, for example, some form of storage that you have in buildings. Of course, with electric vehicles, you see different characteristics of storage, but in a way similar to traditional batteries. And then you might find that with new systems, including coupling to hydrogen and gas system in a different way, again, there will be new opportunities to store energy and use this for balancing. So obviously, this is all flexibility. Much of this, if not everything, well, much, because also like large scale opportunities, will actually come from distributed energy resources connected to the distribution networks. So it is in this context eventually that with more and more flexibility needed, we see that DR in general, storage in particular, including storage, but not only, because again, storage now it's a general concept, and I will show you more what I mean when it's like general concept, and multi-vector coupling of that. All of this can actually be a new source of flexibility. And in these lectures, I really want to show you how this can be modeled and understood, and to some extent also quantified. So that when you look at flexibility with DR, you also start looking at flexibility in a completely different way, also in terms of architecture, because now you realize that flexibility before was coming from transmission system to a distribution system, whereas tomorrow, effectively, with more and more large-scale resources requiring actually flexibility, because before the transmission system was providing flexibility, and flexibility was needed by a demand that would change, so predict and provide. Now, actually, it's the transmission system that, because of variability and uncertainty of large-scale renewables, require potentially more flexibility. And where is this flexibility coming from? Well, what I'm showing you here is that there is a huge opportunity for this to come from distributed energy resources. So completely like you really change dramatically the rationale and the architecture of the operation of the system, because obviously everything we know about system operations and that is linked to control and flexibility in more general terms. So imagine that you have now all these new resources that somehow can interact with the rest of the system, first locally and then at the system level. And again, it is in this light that you really see the transformation that we already envisaged many years ago. I mean, this picture, I like it particularly. It's coming from this more microgrids project. This is 2009 project, was led, it's a European project, was led by Professor Zagiri, and I was fortunate to work in there at the time when I was at Imperial College. I was leading the sort of Techno-Economic modeling system impact studies for the project. And already there, you could really see the transformation that now we're seeing today, where effectively you see with more and more renewables coming into system, including at the low voltage network, so PV, particularly we're seeing now, and to some extent batteries, the potential of having microgrids. And here microgrids is not just isolated microgrids or grids, or microgrids could be disconnected from the system. Also, this idea of smart districts and community edge system we're seeing more and more is part of this. Say, by aggregation and control locally, and then by scaling this to sort of whole distribution networks, you can start interacting at the interface here with the transmission system. So this TSO-DSO interface somehow all comes from this idea that the flow of flexibility changes dramatically compared to the status quo. And then when we talk about virtual power plants, again, that's really what it is. In a traditional system, all the power plants are connected to the transmission system. Now, can we aggregate resources and make them look like a power plant from the point of view of the wholesale market, but also really from sort of technical interactions you have transmission system. So this is what a virtual power plant is, and we will see more towards the end. So when we talk about the smarts, so smart buildings, districts, cities, grids, this is really the essence of all these smarts, of all these transformations that we're seeing, and how they would interact with the rest of the system, providing flexibility. I would like also to highlight here that there are two main characteristics two main changes, or perhaps, well, it's one really fundamental change. Here it's a DNO. In Australia, it's DMSP, like distribution network operator. Here it's a DSO, distribution system operator. This is not semantics. A distribution network operator pretty much will be responsible for poles and wires, maintenance and investment, I think, but not actively managing the system like a system operator would do, like the transmission system operator, independent system operator does in the transmission system. Now you need this DSO here in the distribution level, at the distribution level, because you need to balance the system locally. Otherwise, you can't, first of all, ensure the integrity of distribution networks, as Nando was showing day 3. And second, you're just not able to coordinate properly all these resources to interact with the rest of the system, a wholesale market in particular, but also potentially to provide a number of technical services that, for example, in terms of voltage reactive power support, can be very, very precious also at the distribution network, that eventually would bring quite some economic benefits. So we show all of this in details in the modeling. I'm also seeing some questions. Yeah, just Sarah is asking, could you talk a little bit more about a technical service, how they're evolving? Yes, Sarah, that's a great question. So effectively, what we're seeing here is that the moment you have more and more distributed resources, then say before you had, as I said, this passive management and distribution network to just make sure that networks were big enough to accommodate unidirectional power flows, effective from transmission or distribution. And then if you needed some form of compensation, particularly in reactive power, just put a capacitor or reactor as needed, and there would be really very little management here. Switch on and off capacitor banks when you need to deal with some voltage and all that. Now, imagine that with all these resources, it will really be, they are controllable, and many of them, or most of them, actually inverter based. So with huge capabilities in terms of active and reactive power control, it will really be a sin not to exploit this capability. So say, why would I need to invest into, for example, reactive power resources when actually I can exploit, for example, what inverters can do? Why would I need to reinforce a certain part of the network when actually I can flexibly disconnect some load which I would have contracted before, perhaps? So and other technical services can be bit more sort of like technical, including power quality and all that. So all the new resources and power electronics based resources in particular really allow this transformation, which means that you actually invest much less into assets, invest more into control. So when we talk about the smart grid, what is the smart grid? Effectively, it is a system where the fundamental rationale of providing flexibility and security through asset investment, through redundancy, is shifted towards the rationale of providing security and flexibility through control. And of course, you need to have the technologies, not only to control, but also to be controlled. So all the new technology pretty much corresponds to this. So this is the smart grid, and this is the fundamental architecture shift that we see in the system. Now, how do we actually characterize this flexibility from distributing energy resources? Well, first of all, let's try to describe a little bit more in detail. What is it? I'm taking here the definition was tentatively provided by the Single Working Group 6 to 34, which I am the convener of, and just reading in the context of DR. So really focus on DR, because so far there was no definition really that of flexibility with respect to DR. Flexibility is the ability of one or more resources, so the more means aggregate, to modify the net pressure active and or reactive power injection withdrawal. So this reactive is important. This more resource is important because effectively say it's not only active power, it's reactive power too, because it's needed, especially in distribution networks, different ways. And then it's the aggregate, because then this aggregate can provide local services, can provide wholesale services. And then there are a little bit more features that you can have a look at yourselves. So the focus here is really about aggregation, as I said, but also the fact that because these DR are, of course, distributing the system, you must understand active and reactive power flows, so the physical system and the network constraints, and possibly use all the techniques that you have seen in the previous lectures, including power flows, unbalanced power flows, optical power flows, so linearizations, relaxation, all that, but really trying to take into account capturing the physics properly to maintain network integrity. Now, how do we model this? A very convenient way is looking at this power node model, whereby effectively we can look at the idea of flexibility as flexibility of one resource of an aggregation as a generalized storage model. So effectively, if you look at this, there would be some, imagine this is some form of resource or resource aggregation, it can be just a portfolio or resource in distribution network. As you have input from the grid, then there is some storage in here, like for example, batteries, just to be very, very concrete. And there will be some output power going to the local demand. And then you can model this local demand in a more specific way and also actually detail some more characteristics. So if you like the equations, by the way, I'm going to show very, very few equations because I think that it's just so difficult to give both the perspective, the whole picture, and all the mathematical details. I prefer to give you more general perspectives, and then, of course, in the papers, in the books, there are all the details. So this is one of the few equations actually that I show, but it's also very simple, but you compare to what, for example, Stephen or Maria were showing before. So in fact, it's a very traditional equation. However, it's the concept of how you are modeling now the resources inside this block that matters. There is some form of storage capacity, for example, can be related to the battery. There's, of course, storage energy. Then there is the efficiency of storage, charge and discharge. In this case, it's only associated with charging, but no, it's just a modeling assumption somehow. And then there is a net demand. Then there is the curtailment, both in demand and resources. And then there are standing losses coming from storage. So, and if we look a little bit more in details, there is this net demand that is effectively the local demand minus local generation, for example, local PV. And then this term here, this term W, is effectively flexibility that is coming from curtailment. And what can you curtail? You can curtail demand, so you can curtail a service. We'll show this more later. You can also curtail renewables, which is a form of flexibility. So this kind of equation, in very simple terms, and this modeling is really powerful in a way to represent all the possible flexibility features that one might encounter. Now, how do we translate these flexibility features into actually metrics? So how do we measure this, and possibly how can we visualize a little bit more in detail all of this? And this is just a reference where the just recently published paper where we sort of describe all this in detail, but I will go through the main aspects of this. Let me just have a look at one question, so I'll also breathe a little bit in time. So Jamie is asking, current utilities are DNOs. From experience, utilities are reluctant to adopt new role DSOs. Do you think another entity could take on the role of DSO? If so, how do you envision them interfacing with the utility? That's a great question, Jamie. It's really about are DNOs the one transforming to DSOs, and what is their role if there may be other architectures effectively. Well, what is happening here, for example, in Australia, is that there have been a number of models have been proposed. And for example, in a project that Nanda actually mentioned at Day Edge, it's quite a transformative project. There is we're trying to assess the so-called hybrid model, where there is basically integration of market operation and market operator coming from transmission system and the local DNO, DNSP, where the DNSP is somehow taking up some DSO functionalities when, particularly with regards to technical services. This, as I was mentioning, more active control of local service in both active and reactive power, particularly to deal with the local balances and networks. However, all the market aspects will still be retained by the market operator. So it was a transmission market operator. In Australia, it's an integrated system operator. Both transmission market operation is with AEMO. But then some of these market functionalities are basically brought down to the distribution system. So in the project, this project Edge, that we are effectively studying both the technical aspects, and Nando presented already all these ideas of operating envelopes and all that, but we're also studying the commercial aspects. So how are these distributed markets going to going to work? And then this is just another model, Jamie. There are different models, and I'm actually happy to send you some references later on, a few publications, but also a few reports from different parts of the world. I know pretty well, of course, what's happening in Australia, also in the UK, because of the work there. There are a few more questions coming, but just let me go ahead, and then I will respond to these questions later. So let's then, okay, let me just drink a little bit first. Okay, and then let's have a look then how we can measure this and potentially visualize its flexibility. So toy example. Imagine that this is you have a reference node, active and reactive power coming through a transformer. Can be, for example, medium voltage network, and then in this, well, it's a toy network, but imagine some form of reference node here. There is an interface, and you have, for example, battery, some load, and generator. Can be a diesel generator, can be a hydrogen generator, whatever you wish. It's really a toy system. This is like for teaching purposes, basically, and to demonstrate the fundamental concepts. This is coming from the transactions paper that I just showed you earlier. So when you look at that, a very convenient way of understanding the very first steps of what these resources can do is to describe them in terms of their PQ capability charts. We're very familiar, power system engineers will be very familiar with this PQ capability charts, because basically they tell you from the very beginning what a synchronous machine can do. Because the synchronous machine is the heart of a traditional power system. All system control, as I said, is coming from synchronous machine in both active and reactive power. We know this very well. We studied from the very beginning. So can we actually represent other resources through these PQ capability charts? Of course, if you have a generator that effectively maybe a synchronous generator, it's connected to the distribution network. You can imagine that you have some form of PQ chart. This is not exactly how it would be. It's like a box box constraints, like a box chart, although in reality, it wouldn't really be like this, but just for modeling purposes, just to keep it very, very simple. And then instead of a synchronous generator was an asynchronous generator, like an induction generator, or in case a defig generator and all that, you might have similar characteristics. You know, that doesn't really matter. It's still, it's all conceptual. And then what if you have a battery? So what are the characteristics of a battery? By the way, when you look at this, as you can see, in terms of reactive power, we have both positive and negative reactive power control. Of course, in terms of active power, you only have negative. It is negative because in the previous slide, we assumed that directional power is coming into the system. So it's like positive for load. So if you actually export power as a generator, then it would be negative. And then we're neglecting here minimum stable duration level. Otherwise, you would only have 0 or a certain level, and the operating region would actually be it would be complete non-convex. It would be like to disconnected region, to disjointed region. Now, how about a battery energy storage system? Well, battery energy storage system effectively has got a capability chart this way, because there is basically a full flexibility when you look at the inverter characteristics of providing positive and negative active and reactive power, of course, associated with the amount of energy that you can store. So depending on the energy level you have in the battery, you can provide active power, you can withdraw the power to charge the storage, so you can discharge or you can charge, but you can also very flexibly inject, withdraw reactive power. And then you have a quadratic constraint on the operation of the inverter. And I believe you've seen this also in the previous lectures, but in any case, it's straightforward. Now, the question is, what is the aggregation of this? When I aggregate these two resources, they are the controllable ones. Demand, if demand is fixed, demand overall is only shifting, because it's a fixed value, it's only shifting in terms of active and reactive power, the regions, but is not controllable per se, at least in this case. So what is the aggregation of these two controllable resources? What is the flexibility I can get? Well, that's how do we do this? It's like, how do I sum effectively these two regions mathematically? How do I sum these two regions? The solution is this. So the overall capability of the sum is this. And how have I calculated this? This is coming from Minkowski sum. So the operation of summing these two regions is mathematically vectorial sum down through Minkowski summation. Now, the very interesting thing that you can see is when you look at the area of this region, and I look at the area of the region, and I look at the area of this region, what is it that you really notice immediately? So what you notice immediately, or do you want to try to answer perhaps? What is that you notice really when you look at this picture? It's like, first, just one resource, and then the two resources combined. What is that you notice? Okay, synergy. Thanks, Andre. Yes, that's synergy, that you combined them. And Peter, the area is bigger. Yeah, great, Peter. So the area is much bigger. When you sum this area and this area is much bigger. That's why we aggregate. This is where flexibility, the big benefit of flexibility is. You have one resource, you have another resource, you combine them in a vectorial way, and then suddenly your area that is describing your capability of having different operating points, moving across operating points, is much bigger. So this is the benefit of aggregation. This is the immense value that distributed resources can bring. You have so many tiny, but then actually when you sum them, they grow exponentially, so to speak. I'm not sure how they grow exponentially like mathematical terms, but you understand the concept here. So that's the value of a portfolio. That's the value of aggregation. That's where there is, again, immense potential in having the aggregation in terms of providing flexibility. And of course, when you look at this, no, there is no reason why disaggregate should not be treated as a PQ chart of a synchronous machine. So what we're doing here is effectively trying to see how we could represent the aggregation of DR as a synchronous machine, going back to this, what I mentioned earlier, virtual power plant concept. That's what we're trying to do here, although we're still only looking at sort of steady state characteristics of the system. So in terms of Minkowski sum, and there is more in the paper. If you Google it, you will see immediately what this is. But that's how this the geometrical operation works, and that's how you can see that a tiny bit here and a bit larger here. Then by summing the vertices, you have an area that is somehow much larger. And then depending on the shapes, depending on the size, actually you can grow much bigger. How about network constraints, though? So far, I'm just aggregating resources, but where are the network constraints? Because eventually, if power are flowing up and down, at certain points, I might encounter thermal limits. I might encounter some form of voltage limits. I might encounter some form of over voltage limits, depending on the characteristics of the networks and the power flows and all that. So the actual feasible operating region is not the Minkowski summation of the capability regions of the individual machines. It is subject to network constraints. Unfortunately, mathematically, Minkowski summation of those resources, the resources are convex, can be done in a pretty much straightforward way. Unfortunately, when you start having network constraints, the sort of vanilla modeling of Minkowski summation is no longer possible. You need simulation optimizations, and we'll show you later how to do this. That's why we move from what we call capability to so-called feasibility. Because the moment that you introduce in this toy network some form of thermal limits that you have coming from the networks, some form of voltage limits, again, associated with the network, suddenly what you actually have is a region that is smaller than what we call the capability, because of the network constraints you have in the system. And to do this, you need proper modeling like the ones that Nando was showing, for example, in day 3. What we're doing here, we call this NOE, like nodal operating envelopes, because effectively, if you look at this reference node, this is telling you the operating region in terms of a node as it is seen upstream. Because we're talking about what kind of flexibility you can provide upstream, right? So you aggregate downstream and you provide flexibility upstream in terms of both active and reactive power. So this nodal operating envelope that I'm describing here is effectively doing the job. However, this is not just, you understand now that the very first feature of flexibility, again, is what is the actual capability of the resources? Where are my operating points of the aggregation of resources? Then say, are all of them feasible in network terms? No, not all of them. I need to constrain the feasibility of the resources. But flexibility also means how fast do I move? Remember the sort of flexibility triad I was mentioning earlier. How fast do I move? And then for how long I can sustain, for example, a certain change in my operation. Then I need to introduce new features of this. So how about ramp rates? How fast can I move from one operating point to another? So depending on where I am, and depending on where I want to move, if I am ramp rate constraints, I can only move, for example, in 1 second. If I want to provide a service like a fast frequency response service, which basically means I have headroom available, I am operating in this point, and in principle, when I look at the aggregate, in terms of active power, I can move from here to here. Or actually, if I also consider the network constraints, I call it here virtual because it's like a commercial aggregation, physical because also takes into account the network constraints. I can move from here to here in principle. However, I can do this, I don't know how long it takes to move. So if I need to provide a fast frequency response service, for example, in 1 second, I can only move from here to here. So my actual flexibility region is limited by how fast I can move my operating point. If instead I'm allowed 30 seconds, I can, for example, move here, and 50 seconds I can move here. So with the characteristics of the arm shown here, in 50 seconds, in 1 minute, basically, I can pretty much cover all the operating regions. So this is a ramp flexibility. So what I call here RFE is like ramp flexibility envelope, because these envelopes also, these new envelopes here are also characterizing how fast I can change operating point. Is this enough to characterize flexibility? Well, how long can I change my point for, particularly if I got to storage here and then I am energy constrained? And again, with the same principle, I can only move from one point to another if I got enough energy and then to provide that service, for example, for a certain duration, if there is enough energy to do that. So with a given energy value, how much can I provide in terms of flexibility and how much I can stay over the new operating point depends on both the energy amount and the capacity I am providing. Again, I have this kind of DFE where this is like now duration flexibility envelope. What is the total technical flexibility I can provide? Well, of course, this is now integrating the ramp flexibility and the duration flexibility. And then basically I have this new, what I call technical flexibility envelope, but mathematically is really the intersection of the previous flexibility envelopes. How about cost? Obviously, if I'm operating a certain point, let's say that I'm cost-based, I'm a cost-based aggregator, and then I'm playing the market, and I'm running my OPF, and I am now operating this point. If I now change operating point, because there is a cost function associated with everything, it will cost something to move from one point to another, right? So how much does it cost to move from here to, for example, the black envelope or the blue envelope and all that? Again, this depends on the specific cost characteristics of each resource and then overall of the aggregate. And then I basically associate a new flexibility envelope with the cost that actually requires to move from one operational point to another on the boundary of the flexibility envelope. Why do I do that? Because this is essential to understand commercial flexibility. Because effectively, if I am operating a market, I am now, imagine I am aggregating a portfolio of resources. It is subject to network constraints. And now there is a signal coming from upstream to change my operating point to provide a service. I've just seen that from a cost perspective, moving operational point cost. So I will only provide that service, first of all, if I can technically. Second, if when I look at the cost for providing the service and the benefits that come from the market, this actually makes sense. This is what we called commercial flexibility. That somehow is the intersection of the technical ability and the cost that I have in my system. And then if then the price signals that I receive, for example, are so that it is economically convenient to do this while I am in my sort of commercial envelope here, then I will do it. Otherwise, I won't provide this flexibility. So what I'm trying to represent here in a very sort of canonical way is actually how the system would work. And in the last block, I will show you how there can be actually an active interaction between the commercial aggregators, the distribution system operator, and then the market operation of the system. And conceptually, it's all based on these characteristics here. All of these characteristics somehow can be summarized by so-called Venn diagram, where if I don't consider network constraints, so if I only look at virtual aggregation, eventually, if I look at the different envelopes that I can have in terms of ramp, economics, duration, all that, I end up with so-called commercial flexibility here. But this same commercial flexibility, the moment I also introduce physical characteristics, so in particularly the network feasibility, I see that the actual commercial ability to provide the service is now constrained because I have introduced a new Venn diagram that somehow limiting my capability of providing services because of the network, the network constraints. And now I think you also understand better why I talk about nodal operating envelopes. If you look at again this simple model, imagine now that there are, of course, in a more realistic system, will be lots of resources connected to this network, and then each aggregation here can actually be modeled in PQ terms, exactly by doing this kind of exercise. Basically, you scale this. So each of these areas, it can be, for example, a low voltage network, can actually be modeled as a nodal envelope. And then I aggregate these three regions here. It's a new envelope. And now I have like bigger and bigger areas. And then in here I have a relatively large scale generator, and I have a new envelope. So you see that this concept of flexibility is actually scalable. So I model the aggregation as a nodal envelope with all the different flexibility features. Each envelope can be characterized through all those metrics that I just mentioned. And then I aggregate them. And then I see just there is aggregation benefits because the regions grow bigger and bigger. And then eventually I just scale up the concept. So from a market perspective, this actually corresponds to having hierarchical markets. From a technical perspective, as you can see, it's incredible how much potential there is coming from aggregating or proper aggregation resources, because basically the maps grow bigger and bigger. Now, how would we build these maps? There are different ways. One is by optional power flow. So for example, what you would do here, you look at the resources here, and then you look for finding the extreme points in terms of active and reactive power of these aggregates. So you look for minimizing, maximizing the power flows in terms of active and reactive power. So effectively in the PQ map, you identify some extreme points. And what you would do is you would once you have identified this, particularly you have identified the range of variation of your aggregating map for the reactive power, you basically slice the reactive power regions in different intervals. And then for each interval, then you try to minimize and maximize for the active power flows. So for example, basically, if you take a slice here, you will look at the minimum and the maximum power flow that you have. And then you do this slice by slice, and then basically you end up building this kind of map. So this is like the OPF-based methodology, and there are all the details in this paper. There are also other ways of doing it. It's based on Monte Carlo. For Monte Carlo simulation, for example. In this case, what you would do is you would generate a set of operating points, including in case there is some correlation, because, for example, you have different PV resources. Of course, you want to capture the correlation of the production of PV at the same time in a certain area. Then you run power flows. It's now by power flows that you aggregate the resources. And then you check for network violation, and then you create basically the feasibility map out of the capability map that you would have built. And again, you can find the details in this paper, and there are a couple of other papers that talk about this. Now, let me just go on with a couple of illustrative case studies. Then we can have a break, and then we can also have some live demo. So let's go with an exercise. I'm putting here, again, the capability and feasibility maps. This comes from a paper that Nando was mentioning the other day that is really describing what we're doing this project Edge in Australia. So this is the capability map. This is the feasibility map, including network constraints, still for this kind of toy network. However, now you don't know what these are. So my question to you would be, what is the green resource, the red, the blue, and the purple? Okay, let's let me see someone answering. Not yet. Okay, let me see. Oh, there's someone answering. Okay, green is a battery. Yes, that's great. Go back here. Green is a battery. How do you see green is a battery? Because as you can see, it's got this sort of quadratic shape. And then there is both active and reactive power, positive and negative. Okay, and then, oh, now there are lots of answers. Okay, thank you. So what is red? Well, I'm telling you, red is a load. So how can it be a load? Because we said, before we said the load is given, it only shifts, right? So what I'm doing here, as you can see, loads, it's positive and negative, both in terms of active and reactive power. So this is portion of a load that can be flexible. So given a certain load, a portion of that may be flexible, going up and down in terms of both active and reactive power. For example, you have an air conditioning. Actually, you can ramp up and down the air conditioning load potentially. It's particularly it's inverter based, therefore modulating active and reactive power too. And then of course blue, which as we saw before, again the characteristic of blue is some kind of box constraint that is resembling somehow a synchronous generator, and it's only selling energy because it's negative here. And what is purple? Well, purple doesn't have actually any active power flexibility, but it's got a reactive power flexibility. So purple, for example, could be some form of distribution level fax for reactive power control. And in fact, in the definition that we saw coming from SIGA working group, we actually focused on the fact that flexibility is not only in active power, it's also in reactive power. So the capability of, for example, DFAX, DStatCom, but just also flexible capacitor reactor banks with thyristors and things. I mean, they are really important because they add lots of flexibility, not only in steady state terms, but also in dynamic terms, because it would be a much more complex discussion. And this reactive power modulation is actually essential because it can enhance significantly the hosting capacity of a network. Just to give you an example, again, taken from sort of project that Nando presented. Imagine that you are operating this point, and now you understood that this blue region is effectively how much flexibility I have, which effectively corresponds to somehow the hosting capacity still available in my network. Because this is not the operating envelope, I forgot to say. It's also a representation of the hosting capacity of a network. It's a very synthetic representation of the hosting capacity of a network. And actually, we're doing this in Edge as really as a tool to show how hosting capacity can change dynamically. So when you look at this, effectively, if you don't have under certain reactive power constraints, so say 0 reactive power capability, this is the active power that I can, for example, inject into the system. So effectively, this is somehow the hosting capacity potentially of my network. However, if I move to this operating point, so I actually enable my reactive power capability, for example, by using inverters or by using on-load tap changes or other things, any means to change the reactive power profile of the network. As you can see now, I can actually move from this point to this point. So in terms of active power, I'm now moving from 0 to almost 2, whereas before I was only moving to 1.5. So all this part that I adding here is actually active power capacity, hosting capacity that I am unlocking through reactive power control. And obviously, it can become very, very substantial. Because, for example, in this case, this is just an example. But if I can unlock something like 20% of active power to sell services, but just modulating reactive power can be relatively cheap, well, you understand that there is a big game going on there. And I would like to stop here. I would suggest to have, I'm a little bit late, well, more than a little bit. I would like to stop here, have like a few minutes break. I will also have a look at the questions in the meantime. And then I will just pass the ball to Carmen in the meantime, because Carmen, the next 10 minutes or so, will show you how to actually, it's a simple Python tool to build this kind of operating envelopes and understand all the detail of flexibility from DR with network constraints. So Arthur, I think we can just stop the recording now, break for 5 minutes, and come in the meantime, you can just set up your notebook, and then we start again in about 5 minutes.